Affairs in Spain were becoming serious. The Prince of the Asturias had seized the throne from his father. The emperor summoned them both to Bayonne. My mother often told me how, on this occasion, the anger and hatred of the parents towards their son expressed itself with a directness and vivacity such as our northern and more controlled natures find difficult to understand. The father seemed to find a sort of joy in surrendering his crown as long as it should not be given to his son. The throne was bestowed on Joseph, at that time King of Naples. Consequently, the throne of Naples became vacant. Caroline at once left for Bayonne and returned shortly afterwards, proud and triumphant at having been made Queen of Naples. I could not understand her satisfaction. She had been happy where she was with her husband, free from the cares of state and the obligations of authority. Rich, surrounded by everything that can ensure comfort and confer happiness on others. Yet she was willing, if anxious, to set aside all this in order to obtain a crown. Indeed, the thought delighted her. Happiness consists in a harmony between our tastes and our position in society. Why was it that I could not appreciate the brilliant, distinguished life fate offered me as highly as I would have done the calm tranquility of some more modest lot? Probably because my affection for certain people meant more to me than anything else in the world, and in my position, there was no way in which I could express that affection. To be sure, I had abandoned all my youthful dreams of domestic bliss, and for years had not dared even to think of them again. Sorrow was all that life held for me. How could it be otherwise, since the bond of matrimony, which I believed should be the fairest portion of my existence, was its most galling burden? My children's life, their mother's reputation were at stake in this question of my leaving or remaining in France. It was absolutely necessary that I look after my sons in that country. And there, too, I felt that I must gain the appreciation of the persons whose opinion mattered. That other affection for Monsieur de Flau, whose appeal I had so long resisted, appeared to have been transformed into a tender friendship, a friendship such as my heart desired, and which could console me for the unjust opinion people were beginning to have of my conduct. Who knew me better than the man I had loved so dearly in the past? Who could better appreciate my force of character than he whom I had so long avoided in spite of the strength of my inclination for him? Since the last campaign, he had remained in Germany. The war was over. I no longer worried over the question of his safety. He sympathized with the misfortunes which had befallen me and had written me several times. On his way to take the waters in the Pyrenees, he passed through Paris. I discovered that his sentiments toward me, his respectful admiration had not changed, and I felt that at least his friendship might prove a source of support for me in my affliction. It was in such feelings as these that I sought consolation for all the affection that I failed to find elsewhere. Consequently, I did not seek to hide from the man who seemed worthy of my confidence either my sorrows or the extent of my discouragement, or the hopes which I placed in him. Friendship, I told him, is the noblest sentiment the human heart can conceive, but at the same time, it is also the most difficult to achieve, since it constantly demands perfection. Love demands only a tender reciprocity of feeling. Friendship requires also nobility of ideals. Anyone can be a lover, but how many people know how to remain friends? In other words, how many people can treat another human being with that frankness which admits one's own mistakes combined with that tolerance which accepts the weaknesses of others? Hence, do not fear to confide in me your affection for another woman. I insist that you do so. I am sure of myself. I can bear both my grief and yours too. I want only to be the consoler of misfortune, which is so frequent that to seek its remedy is to assume a duty both arduous and sweet. Monsieur de Flau remained only a few hours in Paris. My complete yielding to all those emotions which I considered quite innocent, and perhaps a tendency to fill my mind with new hopes as vain as the old ones had been. I was preparing more disappointments for myself, which I should become aware of as degrees. I discovered the truth, but as yet I did not surmise what lay before me. The mutual confidence we had promised one another was enough for me. My resolve to forgive whatever there might be to forgive removed all fears of ever being deceived by my friend. One day I went to see Caroline, whom I found in the midst of preparations for her departure for her new kingdom. She hurried about, now inspecting her traveling carriages, now coming back to speak to me, then dashing off to give an order with a smile, returning the next instant to shed a tear. Hortense, she finally said to me, I must confess to you my grief at leaving France in spite of the crown which fate has placed on the head of my children. You have never guessed the depth of my affection for Monsieur de Flau. How often have I feared that his feeling for you was equally intense. You are the only woman in the world I should have feared as a rival. He seemed to care for you, but this affection was only a fictitious one. Although he was young and frivolous, it is impossible he could love anyone as he did me. It is impossible twice to experience the feelings I aroused, and had it not been for my duties and my love for Murat, I do not know whether I should have been able to resist his advances. I dread the despair the news of my departure will cause him. He will perhaps try to console himself in your company, but promise me to not take him seriously. He must remain faithful to me. He has cared for me too dearly to do otherwise. The idea that another woman might attract him would be torture for me. I had let her finish her sentences without interrupting her. My breath failed me. Part of what she was telling me I already knew, but it seemed as though I was hearing it for the first time, so intense was my pain. I collected all my courage and replied, Why should you fear me? You know nobody's interested in me. You are the only woman I'm afraid of, she replied emphatically. I cannot tell how you do it, but you have a secret for attracting men and making them admire and sympathize with you. There are women more beautiful than you are. For instance, I know I'm better looking of the two of us. But you must have some special charm of your own because everyone is drawn to you. 1,000 times I have tried to make Monsieur de Flau say he disliked you. He never would do so. It seemed, when I spoke of you, as though I were referring to some sacred being. But I know you and trust you. I saw him a few days ago when he came through Paris. The glimpse of a bracelet I was wearing upset him, for his love for me is as jealous as it is intense. Your name came into my mind, and I told him the bracelet was a present from you. Promise me when you see him again not to betray me. I promised and returned home in a state of mind which is difficult to describe. Had the man who had sworn he was sincere been deceiving me? I had just learned that another woman had been the object of his attentions at the very time he had declared I, and I alone, occupied his thoughts. True, I had asked only for his friendship, but did that not include complete frankness? Made more wretched than I can describe by this cruel uncertainty, I did not know which way to turn. The consolation I had counted on was once again failing me. More alone than ever, indifferent to everything that went on about me, obliged to keep all my troubles to myself, I grew more ill, and my illness threatened to prove very serious. Frequently, I felt my interest in Monsieur de Flau revive. I said to myself, it is true he deceived me, but perhaps he is bitterly unhappy at the loss of the woman he loves. And if he really is fond of her, how could he have spoken about the matter to me? The one thing he did, which was wrong, was to make me believe that I was the only woman he cared about. But he is sad and in pain. I must forgive him. We must again be friends. He returned to Paris before Caroline's departure, but left at once for the Spanish front. I was at Saint-Cloud at the time with my mother, who had come back from Bayonne. As soon as Queen Caroline had informed him of our conversation, Monsieur de Flau wrote me and explained everything. He declared Caroline had told him that she had spoken as she did in order to separate us, and added, I am sure that after our conversation, Hortense will not care for you anymore. She is too romantic to do so under such conditions. And that was what I wanted, as the idea that you cared for her was very disagreeable to me. Monsieur de Flau wrote me these details, and I believed him. They seemed probable enough. Perhaps, too, I wished to deceive myself. Nevertheless, there remained in my mind a feeling of suspicion, which prevented me from being entirely at ease. Henceforward, no man's affection seemed to me stable enough to be depended upon. And yet, how can one live without some such support? My mother had come back from Bayonne. The visible change in my health frightened her, and she wished me to come and live with her at Saint-Cloud. Life as it was there, Although it had charmed me before my marriage because I had found much with which to occupy my time, now wearied me on account of its futility and the need I felt of having occupations which would take my mind off my own worries and give me something to do that was not directly connected with myself. Instead of that, I was not left alone an instant. I spent the mornings in my mother's drawing room, where she worked on her embroidery, surrounded by her ladies in waiting. 4 hours on end, I would sit beside one of these ladies, watching her thread go in and out, without being able to say a word or follow a line of thought. Every few minutes, my mother would leave the room in order to receive some visitor or hear some petition. She did not dare leave the palace for fear the emperor might wish to see her and might come along the balcony looking for her, as he did frequently. Between the completion of some special task and a meeting of his ministers, he often took a little stroll with her. It was he who fixed the hour at which we were to go driving with him. We always had to be exactly on time, and almost always were obliged to wait an hour or two for the council meeting to be over. Finally, the emperor appeared, and through wind, rain, or snow, he would drive for several miles in the country, returning finally to the palace. Often the emperor, his mind still full of the problems that had been discussed at the meeting, or busy with some other weighty question, would hardly say a word. After the drive, we dressed for dinner, which we took alone, the emperor, the empress, and I. Sometimes the conversation was not more lively than it had been during the drive. After dinner, the emperor returned to his work. The empress played a game of whist in her drawing room. I did not care for cards, but nevertheless played also until 10 or 11 o'clock, when we all went to bed. The emptiness and dreariness of such a monotonous life were more than I could bear, and the weakness of my lungs increased. Madame de Broc heard what an alarming condition I was in. For a long time I had been longing to have her with me, but did not wish to disturb her happiness or make any effort to bring her to me. As soon as she heard how ill I was, she hastened to my side. Her excellent husband willingly consented to the sacrifice. No sooner had she arrived than I poured out to her sympathetic ear all my troubles. Her presence was a relief to me. My husband had given up writing to me. He, several times, even returned my letters without having broken the seal, after having pointedly pushed them aside in the presence of his courtiers. I felt that I had done wrong in not acceding to his request that I should travel to Holland for my confinement. Since I was no longer present, his suspicious nature, having no direct object, busied itself with affairs of all those about him. If a French courtier who was familiar with our married life tried to defend me when my reputation was attacked, he would at once be dismissed from court. He considered they must be spies, either of mine or of the emperor. Already the king had received several reprimands from his brother about the smuggling that went on between Holland and England. The emperor always considered subjects in their broad lines. The king, on the contrary, was only interested in minute details. A single idle phrase was enough to arouse his suspicion. He reflected as to what reasons might have prompted it, drew all sorts of conclusions from it, and finally discovered a treasonable significance that had no basis other than the activity of his own imagination. The result was that the majority of the Frenchmen whom he had taken to Holland with him were dismissed on account of something they had said, some doubt he had conceived in regard to their conduct. Instead of being definitely dismissed, however, they were sent on special missions or received other posts, as, for instance, Monsieur de Caulaincourt, whom he appointed ambassador to Naples. The others were shifted about. Monsieur de Arjousson, who had been the king's high chamberlain, became my first gentleman in waiting. Messieurs de Vaux and de la Ville were appointed my equerries. Consequently, in a short time, I had so numerous a household that I did not know how to pay them all, especially as my income, which I received from France, was only that of a French princess. Monsieur de Cazes also arrived with a letter from my husband appointing him my private secretary. I had already Monsieur Desprez, an elderly man who had been with me for a long time and with whom I was thoroughly satisfied. This was the only occasion on which I refused to carry out my husband's wishes in regard to my household. I had my reasons for doing so. A few days before my departure from Cotteret, Monsieur de Cazes, a fine-looking young man with excellent manners, arrived there. I received few visitors. He knew my reader and came to call on her. grief-stricken over the loss of his charming young wife, who had died after they had been married 17 months. He was seeking some way of taking his mind off his sorrow. The object of his journey made him a sympathetic figure to us. He asked to be presented to me and appeared so unhappy that I did not feel justified in refusing his request. The day I met him, he spoke of his wife, of his grief at losing her, and the need he felt of leaving France after such a shock. He wished me to obtain a post for him at my husband's court. I suggested that he secure an introduction through his father-in-law, Monsieur Memoirs, when he returned to Paris, and promised that I would also use my influence with the king. My trips into the mountains were just beginning at that time. I saw the young man only once more, and then did not hear him mentioned again. Monsieur de Cazes' father-in-law, who was president of the Court of Cassation, presented him to my husband as I had suggested, and the king, on our return to Paris from the Pyrenees, appointed him his secretary and sent him off immediately to Holland. I heard one day someone belonging to the Murat household say meaningfully, "The Queen of Holland saw a great deal of a certain young man while she was taking the waters and secured a post for him at her husband's court." That was very clever of her, I'm sure. I could not imagine that this bit of spiteful gossip referred to anyone I knew as slightly as I did Monsieur de Cazes, and I paid no attention to it. But when Monsieur de Cazes returned from Holland as to assume the duties of my private secretary, the remark came back to me, and I declined to accept him. The Queen of Naples, one day when she was visiting me, remarked, "Did you know that people are saying that you've taken a fancy to that young man?" I have had this repeated to me so many times that I wasn't sure myself about it, but I have just been watching you both, and I see there's nothing in the story. Nevertheless, he is both vain and a braggart, for Fouché tells me that he goes about saying he is on the best of terms with you. Greatly astonished that the chief of police, instead of mentioning to me something that concerned me directly, should talk about it to persons who he knew would be only too glad to have reasons for criticizing me, I demanded that he explain such an absurd remark. He seemed embarrassed, put the blame on the conceitedness of the young man and the bad effects such gossip had on my reputation, even on the fact that it was he who had asked the Princess Caroline to warn me. At last, I became impatient with him for his evasions. On the other hand, how could I suspect the motives of Monsieur de Cazes? I had only known him when bowed down with grief over the loss of his wife. Tears always make one think well of the person who sheds them. What reasons had I for believing that the sorrow of a stricken husband was a mask to conceal the vanity of a coxcomb? Being still young, I had not lost faith in the existence of frankness and loyalty. A too justifiable distrust of human nature had not yet made me critical and suspicious of people's motives. Moreover, Monsieur de Cazes, as a member of my husband's household, must have known the king's character and been aware of our domestic difficulties, nor could there be any doubt that, like all Frenchmen living in Holland, he realized it was I who was in the right. My misfortunes made everyone sympathize with me, and the public hesitated to condemn my behavior. In order to banish all doubts from my mind, I thought it necessary to inform Monsieur de Cazes of the remarks that were attributed to him. I expected that he would be deeply pained at such gossip. He defended himself more or less vigorously, but when he realized that people might believe he had enjoyed my favors for even a short time, a satisfied smile showed that his vanity was rather flattered and betrayed the true character of a man whom I had considered honorable simply because he happened to be in distress. I admit that I was wrong in treating him in a manner he misrepresented. After that, he never appeared in my presence except when he came with messages from my husband. The king, as soon as I refused to include Monsieur de Cazes among my household, granted him numerous favors. Nevertheless, I soon learned the source of the various rumors that were being skillfully disseminated. In the pains taken to sully everything and everybody in any way connected with the Empress, I recognized the hand of Fouché, one of the most ardent partisans of the Emperor's divorce. To serve his ends, it was necessary to discredit all the members of the family he sought to force into retirement. My brother's position was impregnable. But how was I to escape the intrigues of a minister so well placed to produce evidence in support of his accusations? A woman in such cases is always helpless. The public knew the esteem the emperor had for me. He had shown it on numerous occasions. In order to change his opinion of me and that of the general public, nothing was simpler than to declare that I was involved in some entirely fictitious liaison. This maneuver and many others were necessary in order that Fouché might have excuses for defending the idea of a divorce, which France in general did not want. My mother was too popular. She was too good, too generous, too amiable, too willing to listen to every appeal for help and to aid anyone who might be in trouble. People could not dream of there being anyone kinder than she, or imagine that a better or nobler person could exist. The public's affection was increased by the fear it had of losing her.